Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to welcome everybody tonight to our study on the book of Genesis. And why don't we go ahead and pray, and then we'll jump right into Genesis chapter number 20. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for each and every one who has joined us tonight to study about your word. So, Lord, I pray that our time tonight is fruitful, that we represent your text in a responsible way, and most of all, that we learn things that we can apply to our lives and see things that reveal your true and unchanging character. For these things, Lord, we give you praise. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, so tonight we're going to continue in the book of Genesis, and we're in chapter number 20. And basically, we need to view what we're going to read tonight, chapter 20, in light of what we have went over the last several weeks, beginning back in chapter number 17, where Yahweh comes to Abraham and reveals that he is going to have a child with Sarah. And then in the next chapter, Yahweh comes with two angels and visits Abraham and reveals to Sarah that she will have a child, and his name will be called Isaac. And then the two angels proceed into what we seen last week, chapter 19, which was the destruction of the cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, and that's where we left off. So we're going to pick up basically right there, and we're going to go through 18 verses, and we will probably actually get done a little bit early tonight. I actually was preparing and attempting to include chapter 21, but chapter 21 is pretty important and needs a little more time. So I thought I would just go with a shorter night, and we can give more attention and detail to chapter 21. So think about this. Chapter 20 is still part of what's included in between the appearance of Yahweh in 17, promising that this set time the next year, Sarah would have a child. And so you basically have approximately a year span where all of the things that we've read in chapter 18 and 19 and what we're going to read here takes place in between basically the announcement that Isaac would be born and his actual birth, which we'll see next week in chapter number 21. So keep some of these things floating around in the back of your mind, because they will help us to interpret and see what's really going on here in the text that we read tonight. Verse 1, and Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country. Let's ask a question real quick. Where's from thence? Where was he the last time that we seen him in the text? Let's look at our map for just a second. If you'll remember, back in chapter 19, the cities of the plain in this area right here were destroyed. And Abraham had walked with Yahweh in the chapter prior. Basically, we would presume to this mountain range where he could overlook the valley or the plain that was there at that time. And we presume that he would be either there or he had returned back to where he was living there at the Oaks of Mamre there in Hebron. So that would be where he is going from. He has been there for some time. This is where he has been living. And it says that he journeyed from there toward the south, which is called the Negev, there in the land of Canaan. It says, and he dwelt between Kadesh. Let me see if we can zoom out here. Kadesh is right here. And Shur, which would be this direction. So he dwelt somewhere in this area for a period of time, but at some point it says, and he sojourned in Gerar, which is right up here. So it's not that far from where he was. So he changes locations and he's dwelling in a place called Gerar. Now this name is probably given to the location by Abraham because of what it means. It's taken from the root gar, which means to dwell or sojourn. And so he probably gave it that name. It probably had a different name prior to that, Canaanite name. But that's what we have here. Verse 2, and Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. Now, where did we hear this before? Chapter 12, right out of the gate. Whenever he comes to Canaan, there's a famine. So he goes to Egypt, and it was arranged that he would say that Sarah is his sister. Now, why would he make that statement? Because he feared that his life would be taken, because Sarah was beautiful, and he would be killed, and she would be taken and married by someone else. Now, what's interesting is in the first story, in Genesis chapter 12, she's not a young woman. And she certainly isn't at this point. Okay? How old would she be at this point? 89 to 90. Around in there. And he's still concerned about her being taken and him being killed. So you have to wonder, how good looking was Sarah? Because it's not like this was the earliest patriarchal days where they lived 1,000 years. Okay? Sarah only lives, as we'll see later on, to be 127 years old. So she's not in her prime. Matter of fact, it has been pointedly said that it is past the time when she can even have children. Okay, so a lot of questions that we have when we read this. So Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent. Now, Abimelech literally means my father is king. Now, either he was given this name by Abraham, or he was renamed by the author of this narrative, which we would believe to be Moses, or he had this name given because there were shared terms between the Canaanites and the Hebrew people, because the languages were so very similar. And that's likely the case. So he sent and took Sarah. So apparently she still got some looks going her way. And he sends for her, being the king, and takes her. Now watch what happens in verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him. Now who came to him? God, which would be who? It would, but what does the text say? Look at it. Capital G only, which would be what Hebrew word? Elohim. So Elohim came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, you are but a dead man. For the woman which you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now, he doesn't realize that because he's been told, he's been lied to, that she is Abraham's sister. So he takes her and obviously has the desire to make him one of his wives. And God has to intervene again by a dream and basically say, hey, if you don't stop what you're doing or what you're planning to do, you're going to die. Because she is a man's wife. Now watch what is said in verse 4. But Abimelech had not come near her. What does that mean? He had not slept with her. Now, we said back in chapter 12 that it was pretty likely and probable that she was violated when they were in Egypt because of the dowry gifts that were given to Abraham on behalf of Sarah being in his home. Okay? So, watch what is said in verse 4. But Abimelech had not come near unto her, he had not slept with her, and said, Lord, what should this word be known as? Adonai, which is basically, Sir, will you not slay? Will you slay also a righteous nation? So what is he saying here? That God is going to not only judge him, but everyone under his power. You don't think authority is important in the ancient world, and you don't think they understood it? Even this man who is a king, whom Abraham presumed would do unrighteously. Okay? And we're going to see some error here in Abraham again. We're going to see his humanity. He presumes that if they go into Gerar, that Sarah will be taken, even if they knew that she was his wife. That's an assumption that I believe we'll see in this narrative would prove to be a false assumption, because Abimelech is actually more of an upright person than he was given credit. And he justifies himself in verse 5 by saying, said he not unto me, she is my sister? And she, even herself, said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. So he's justifying himself to God. And he's saying, hey, I did this unknowingly. I didn't know that she was this man's wife. He plainly said, she's my sister. And she even affirmed that and said that she was, that he was her brother. And so he's trying to justify himself. Now, something that was said in verse 4 that we'll understand in hindsight as we read along and look back on what's been said is that the whole nation is in trouble. And what we need to understand is, obviously, God has plagued the king's house, and the people under his authority because of what has been done. Him taking her into his house and going to marry her. Now, he hasn't had sex with her, but we're going to see part of the reason why he hasn't. It may not be so much that he is so upright or he is so righteous, or it may be partially due because of the plague that has come upon him, and he has not been able to. So let's read along and have these things floating around in our minds. And God said, verse 6, and God said unto him in a dream, yea, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. But watch what else he says. Scratch out for and write and, because for is just, it's not in the text. And I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Notice that God affirms, okay, you didn't know. However, the reason you didn't go in and lie with her is due to the restraining power that I have enforced upon you. And I believe that can be seen in light of the plague that has come upon him and has affected all of the people under his care. Notice something very interesting about this that God says. Let me highlight it. For I withheld you from sinning against who? Me. First and foremost, adultery is a sin against God. And that's what God says here. I withheld you from sinning against me because I suffered you not to touch her. And I believe we can understand this in light of what God has allowed to come upon him physically in the form of some type of plague that has not allowed him to go into her. Because something that we don't see right off the bat when we jump into this narrative is the amount of time that this has played out. This didn't happen overnight. There are probably months involved here, because we're going to see in verse 17 and 18 that everyone under this king's power was unable to bear children. Well, you don't know about your inability to bear children overnight. Right? That's a no-brainer. It takes several months for you to know that, hey, nobody's bearing children, nobody's becoming pregnant. What's going on? So this scene that we're reading has played out over probably up to a couple of months, which is interesting because you don't have a whole lot of time to play with from the pronouncement that she would be pregnant by Abraham and bear a son till him actually coming on the scene about a year later, right? Because you're pregnant over 9 months. So you only have a few months of play or wiggle room there that she has to become pregnant. Now, verse 7. Now, therefore, restore or return the man his wife, for he is a prophet. He's a lying prophet, but he's a prophet. Right? I think stories like this that are included in the Bible should give us some hope that God can use us and that He doesn't demand moral perfection. It should be our goal, but He understands that we're going to fall short, and that's why Jesus came. But I think it's interesting that He says, you need to restore this man his wife, even though he pretty much got you in this predicament. And by the way, he's a prophet. And he shall pray for you, and you shall live. Again, the fact that he will live if Abraham prays for him is because he has been stricken of God, which is why he hasn't went into Sarah yet. And let's read on. He shall pray for you, you shall live. And if you restore her not, or return her not, know that you shall surely die. Dying, you will die. You and all that are thine. Again, we see how important it is for authority figures to make sure that they keep themselves right before God, because everyone under their care and power will be affected by their decisions. Do you see that? If he doesn't make the right decision here and return Sarah, not only will he die, but everyone in his kingdom will die. That's very weighty and very strong, and it shows the responsibility that leaders bear and the need for them to walk in integrity and honor the Lord first and foremost. Verse 8. Therefore, Abimelech rose early in the morning. Can you blame him? And called his servants and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. Again, they're a little more righteous than Abraham gave them credit because they have a reverential fear of God. If they didn't, the king wouldn't have rose up early and they wouldn't be afraid. Now, I also believe that the fact that they've all been stricken probably carries some weight, and they realize the seriousness of what's going on, and they have the explanation that they've probably been wondering, why are we stricken all of a sudden when this stranger comes to our town and the king takes this woman into his house? There had to have been questions about, ever since she's come in the house, things ain't going well for anybody. Okay, so they're afraid. Verse 9, Then Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, What have you done unto us? And what have I offended thee or sinned against thee, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. Now, I think we can see the king's frustration here, because truly Abraham does bear the blame and the responsibility for what has taken place because he lied. And that's what opened the door for this whole situation. Verse 10. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that you have done this thing? Man, there's a good point to be made here. What did you see about us that made you assume we wouldn't do the right thing? I think we need to be careful about prejudging matters and people before they are given the chance to prove themselves, which is exactly why you shouldn't listen to gossip. Because when you listen to gossip, it creates a filter of which you view that person that has been talked about to you through. In the back of your mind, floating around, are the things that you've heard about that person, and you will pass judgment upon that person even though you yourself haven't seen and witnessed what you've heard about them. Okay? So, Abraham makes this mistake. He just assumes that he's the only righteous person on the planet or in the land of Canaan. Everybody else is heathens. There's nobody else righteous. And if I tell them the truth, they won't do the right thing. I think he's been proven wrong here. This may not be a Yahweh worshiping group of people, but he should have given them more credit than he did. Y'all see this? Now notice the response here in verse 11. I'm going to scroll back up to the top. Verse 11. And Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. That was assumption. That was a faulty assumption. He prejudged what he didn't know. And look at the mess it's caused. Look at the people that it has affected. When we listen and make assumptions and make decisions based off those assumptions, people pay the price. And we're responsible for that. You see the lesson we can learn about gossip in Genesis chapter 20? And assumptions and judging, being critical in judgment, overly critical in judgment. We'll actually see that here when we get to chapter 7 of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount. I think God's been trying to tell us some things and help us to mature and grow. Because there are a lot of things that we've been covering in Genesis and in the Sermon on the Mount and other things that the Lord has led me to share that are recurring themes. You think it's arbitrary, or do you think God's trying to lead us into a higher level of character and morality? I believe He is. I believe He is. So he said, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Verse 12. And yet, indeed, she is my sister. Notice he tries to justify himself. Isn't that human nature? Just own our sins, you know? I believe that goes a long way with God. Because you know what happens when we try to justify ourselves? We become self-righteous. Justifying self equals self-righteousness. You are declaring yourself as righteous or just. And when you declare yourself as righteous and just, and you're not righteous in how you're declaring, he's obviously not righteous in what he has done, then that can open the door for us to fall into pride and become no different than the Pharisees, who become blinded to the truth and full of self-righteousness. But he goes on to say, and yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. He's throwing semantics out there, right? And she became my wife. This may be true, but the way you portrayed it was not in truth. It was manipulative and it was to save his own skin. Now, what's crazy about this is he lied back in Genesis 12, and it's likely she was defiled in doing so, which shows Abraham willing to do this again, knowing that likely she was defiled earlier on in Genesis 12, years before this, and the fact that he would be willing to put her through that again shows that he is far from a perfect man. In this chapter, he is a jerk. I will agree. It's not fair what he does, and it's very selfish. He's willing to allow the people of the city to suffer and his own wife. Now, in light of verse 12, and what he says, she is the daughter of my father, how is that true? Anybody remember? No flipping back from memory. Anybody remember? Terach is the father of who? Abraham, Nahor, and the oldest was who? Who was Abraham's oldest brother? Haran, who died young, right? But he had what? Daughters who were sisters, Milcah and Sarah, or Sarai. And they were married by who? Nahor and Abraham. So they both married their nieces, which were from their father's side, right? So there is some truth to what he's saying, but the intent is not true. What he said, his intentions and what he said at the beginning of this narrative are not true. He was not being forthright. He was using it for his benefit at her expense and their expense. Now let's read on. Verse 13. It came to pass when God caused me to wonder. God caused him to wonder. It's a very derogatory thing that he says about God, because it means to wander aimlessly and hopelessly. So he's kind of trying to justify himself even at God's expense here. Yeah, it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, this is the kindness which you shall show unto me. At every place where we shall come, say of me, he is my brother. So they had made this arrangement back when they left his father's house, that everywhere they go, it would be said that she was his sister. So you have to wonder, we have two examples, chapter 12 and this example in chapter 20, of him lying to save his own skin. And you have to ask the question, how many times has this happened? Or did he just make this up to justify himself at this moment and say this to the king? We don't know. The answer is not in the text. But it makes us wonder. Now watch what happens in verse 14. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham. Same thing that happened when they were in Egypt. And restored him Sarah, his wife. So he does what God says, and he blesses Abraham, even though Abraham has caused this entire problem. Which is going to in turn bless him. Because remember the promise that was made to Abraham? I'll bless those that bless you and I'll curse those that curse you. So him blessing Abraham is going to work for his benefit. So he blesses Abraham and also restores Sarah, his wife. Verse 15. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. dwell where it pleaseth thee. Which again speaks of the integrity of Abimelech, because Pharaoh asked Abraham to get out of his land. Right? He gave him gifts and sent him out of his land. Abimelech said, hey, here's the land. Before you dwell where you want. In other words, you have the choice of where you want to dwell, which is a significant thing to say to a man who is very, very, very wealthy and has large flocks and herds and livestock. So it shows that he's honoring him, even though in light of everything that has transpired. And unto Sarah he said, verse 16, behold, I have given your brother. I think he's still a little bit irritated. I love it. I love that verse. He said, I have given your brother. I think he said it that way too. 1,000 pieces of silver, which would be 1,000 shekels of silver. Shekel being a weight. A shekel is basically not quite half of an ounce. And a shekel, 1,000 pieces of silver shekels is a significant amount. I believe in the ancient world of this time, like an average laborer's wage would be 6 shekels a year. So on that average, he received 166.67 years wages at the rate of an average laborer of that day. An extravagant amount of money. 50 pieces of silver or silver shekels would have been a great gift as a dowry gift, a marriage gift for someone who is going to marry some woman who is given to them. 50. He gives 1,000 pieces of silver. And behold, it should be it, is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other, thus she was reproved or vindicated. In other words, here's compensation for what she's been put through. Okay, so not only does he honor Abraham, but he honors Sarah as well. Again, what are we seeing here? He's a little more honorable of a guy than he was given credit. He's doing the right thing. He's obeying God. And he's honoring God's chosen, God's elect. I think it's very fascinating. Verse 17. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed what? God healed Abimelech, which explains why he was not able to go in unto her. God said, not this time. It's not going to happen. And it doesn't say what he was healed of, but evidently whatever was going on in his body prevented him from sleeping with Sarah, which I believe was the major purpose of God allowing it to come upon him. Okay? So God healed Abimelech and his wife. It affected Abimelech's wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. Again, which shows us that this has taken place over not just a few days, but likely up to a few months. Because they were aware that they were not able to have children. And of all people, to pray for this plague to be removed is the one who caused it all. What irony to this story. You know they have to be like, this guy, I wish he'd just leave. Verse 18 says, for the Lord has had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Why? Because ultimately she was the one who was being done wrong the most. She was the biggest loser of everyone in this story. And on her account, on her behalf, just like we seen while they were in Egypt, God vindicates her, and God plagued Abimelech and Abimelech's house with the same type of judgment that ultimately they were preventing in her. Because while she's in Abimelech's house, her and Abraham can't make Isaac. Okay? So they are all barren until Abraham prays. So, I told you guys we were going to be done early, and we actually pulled it off for the first time ever. So, you're welcome. At this time, we will give you an opportunity to ask any questions about what we just read.
So that plague didn't come on them until it took Sarah to his house. So how long were they there?
It doesn't say how long they're there, but we know they had to be there for some duration because they were aware they were unable to have children. And, they didn't have the luxury of going to Walmart and buying a test they could pee on and know if they were pregnant. Yeah, so you have at least a month that they have to be there. Because they had to skip a cycle pretty much to know, hey, I'm pregnant. Or potentially pregnant, or something's going on. So this had to have played out over some period of time.
So if God put plague on when he took her into his house, why didn't he tell him he was a dead man when he knew what he was going to do anything? That he could do.
He said, you're a dead man if you don't restore her to the man to whom she is wife. So if he wouldn't have returned her to Abraham, the sickness that he had that prevented him from sleeping with her would have taken his life. And again, it doesn't say what the issue was or what the plague was for him. It says they were unable to have children, but, because it says in verse 18 that the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech. We know that couldn't have been the problem he had because he don't have a womb. So he had some type of element or sickness that kept him from having sex with Sarah and would have taken his life had he not responded to God coming in the dream.
So everybody was, all the men were impotent and all the women couldn't.
It doesn't specifically say that all the men were impotent.
But then none of them had got pregnant.
Nobody was getting pregnant. That's what's stated. But everybody under his power was affected because of the statement that he made to the Lord. Are you going to kill the entire nation? Which would indicate that probably everybody was affected by whatever was going on. Peggy?
This makes me feel good. I mean, Abraham was a prophet, and he really screwed up. So it kind of makes me feel like there's hope for me.
There's hope for everybody. Everybody can be used despite our mistakes. But one thing that Abraham always had was an unbreakable loyalty to God. He made mistakes, and obviously this is a very bad mistake, but he never broke his loyalty or his heart being after Yahweh as the one true and living God. He never fell into idolatry, and he never, for a prolonged duration, habitually, willfully rebelled against God. He had moments where he disobeyed, moments where he screwed up, but his heart was after God. That's what God's looking for, faithfulness and loyalty. He understands we're not going to be perfect. If we could be perfect, Jesus is not necessary.
Do you think he might have had in the back of his mind if each time that this happened?
Who in the back of whose mind?
Abraham.
Yeah, because of what happened when they went to Egypt. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Her question is basically, do you think Abraham knew that if he basically played out the same scenario that he did when he went to Egypt, given how it worked out for him there, that it would happen again? The answer's not in the text. I mean, it did happen. I mean, it's pretty crazy that a guy chosen by God can do the wrong thing and still come out smelling like a rose.
Okay.
That'd have to irritate you if you're Abimelech, you know.
Okay, now he protected Sarah with Abimelech, but why was she, why did she protect her when she's in Pharaoh?
When she was with Pharaoh, the reason why I said it's fairly likely that some relation took place is because it specifically says in that passage, if you go back and read it, that he gave gifts to Abraham because of Sarah. And usually only gifts would be given to the male who gives the woman to be wedded in exchange for the marriage.
Did you think, did Pharaoh know that she would?
And the difference in this story and in the story in Egypt, Pharaoh gave the gifts before. Abimelech gives the gifts at the end, which again testifies to the greater character in Abimelech. He gave the gifts after the fact, after he knows what has just happened. He still blesses Abraham and sends him on his way. So you have to wonder, undoubtedly there's some things that were discussed in the dream that we are not privy to. We don't have all the details. And the Lord may have said, hey, you better bless him before he leaves. We don't know. But like I said, even though he did bless him with an extravagant offering and all the other livestock and things like that, it's going to work for his good because of the promise on Abraham's life. I'll bless those that bless you and I'll curse those that curse you.
Don't we see him really act out of fear, though? Doesn't it state that basically he feared for his life?
Out of his own mouth, he said, because I feared
Yeah.
that you guys didn't have a fear of God and you'd kill me. So, yeah, it's a testimony to the fact that he has some fear of not receiving the promise.
But he didn't trust God.
Why did they go there if he's afraid?
It doesn't say why he goes to Gerar. You have to understand in antiquity, if you had large herds and livestock, as he did, with the sparseness of vegetation sustainable for livestock, you would have to move. You'd have to be kind of like a nomad. Most of the people who were shepherds or who had livestock were nomads. They moved from place to place because in the land, there's just, if you've ever been there, you know there's not just a ton of sustenance for livestock. Of all places for him to dwell, he's dwelling in the south, which is honestly the worst place to dwell if you have a lot of substance. Matt?
Just interesting how he went to bat. I mean, he bargained with God for Lot, and then he went and saved Lot from the kings and how he fought for Lot, but yet he's always willing to turn his wife over because of fear. But anyway, we're throwing Abraham under the bus tonight.
We've seen the same thing in Lot too. You know, he was willing to offer his daughters to rescue what he thought was men at that time when the men of Sodom wanted to come and have sex with what they thought were men. Another piece of irony in this story, in the story of Abraham speaking with Yahweh about, you know, far be it from you, Lord, to destroy this whole town, you know, because of wicked people, you know, if there's righteous people there. And you have this same king saying the same thing to God. Are you going to destroy a righteous nation because of this when I did it unknowingly? And so you have a lot of parallels in these stories that are very similar. Even more so when you look at it in its original context, some of the word plays that are going on. We miss it in English, but it really jumps out. There's a lot of purposeful literary style of writing going on throughout these narratives that would really jump out and capture the attention of the original audience who read, the original text.
You said that God, that adultery is a sin against God, and you also went on to say that God doesn't require moral perfection. Will you explain that to me?
God understands that we're not going to be perfect morally. We should strive for it. It should be every one of our goals to be like God, and God is perfect. But the reality is we all screw up. We all make mistakes. But we don't stop. That's the key. These all died in faith. They didn't give up. They stumbled, they failed, they made mistakes, but they never broke their loyalty to God. That's what it's all about. It's all about faithfulness, being steadfast, constant, consistent, and being willing to repent when you do make mistakes. Own it. Don't justify yourself. Just own it. I believe God really values when we're just honest and say, you know what? I screwed up today. I'm sorry. I'll try to do better. Give me strength. Give me grace to do better. And He will honor that. Because God gives grace to the humble. And He resists the proud. If we try to make excuses and justify ourselves, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. Because He's not going to help us. Matt?
It seems like we're really pointing out that Sarah, see if I'm correct in my assumption, my thinking, that Sarah was so uniquely beautiful that the kings wanted her. But would it be a true statement to say that they probably looked through every group that came through their area to see if there was a beautiful woman that they would have wanted?
Yes.
So we think we're out, but it's really probably was a very common practice.
Basically, in antiquity, you would have people who were rulers who would basically get what they wanted. And if there was someone beautiful that they wanted, they were the authority. They would see to it that they got what they wanted. I mean, King David even did that himself. He seen a woman he thought was beautiful. Even though she was the wife of one of his best and most loyal warriors, he got what he wanted because he could. And that was the fear of Abraham. So we have to be careful about being too critical on Abraham, because we might get to heaven someday and he might slap us around and say, hey, you wasn't there, you don't know what it's like. You know what you're talking about. Because their culture was far more a dog-eat-dog culture. Every man out for themselves. And people were not as passive as they are today. We are a lot more civilized as far as violence and in a lot of ways than the people were in antiquity, because you have different people groups that are established in the land, and you honestly don't know as a stranger who you can trust. I mean, it would be, the equivalency today would be like to drop one of us off in Korea and see how we felt about that. We'd be on edge. We would be uneasy. We would fear for our life. And so we need to take some of those into consideration.
Well, one more like,
Isn't the point of the story, though, about giving people the benefit of the doubt? As far as meeting the people, he says, why would you think we would do that?
I believe that one of the greater themes of this story is what we spent some time talking about, is the poor assumption of Abraham. He didn't give them any benefit of a doubt. He judged them unrighteously, and therefore it created this entire problem, this entire scenario, of which many people were affected by it. In the end, the story ends well, but You know, the fact that it was drawn out over probably a couple months tells us that, you know, a lot of people suffered and paid the price for it.
Well, why wouldn't they punish for having concubines? And they had got to women.
Why wasn't who?
The kings, they had concubines. Why were they allowed to have so many wives?
It was the custom of their day that they basically got what they want. It doesn't mean that God viewed it as morally okay. You know, the fact that they had multiple wives, honestly, was most likely just a way to justify getting to have sex with whoever they wanted to because they're my wife. You know, they're my wife, so it's okay to have sex with them because they're my wife. You know, I just happen to have one for each day of the month. So, you know,
Were they Mormons?
they were extreme if they were.
Didn't they also have to provide for the wives that they took on as wives, or usually just the rich people?
Yeah, it would be men who would be noble men that had wealth. Usually kings or prominent people. But if you'll remember in the Torah, it was commanded to Israel, when you get into the land, you're going to be tempted to be like the other nations. And you're going to want to set up a king just like the other nations. And you're going to want to multiply wives unto yourself like the other nations. And you're going to want to get horses and armies like the other nations. And he gives all these warnings about doing that. Of course, like God's people have always done throughout history, they don't pay attention very well to what he asked. And they suffered and paid the price for it. Gary?
I'm not sure if this is true. Is there ever a defense of oneself where it's not self-righteous? Where one's seeking, if there's half-truths or things that, like the example that you were given, or is it always, if you're seeking that, it's always self-righteous?
In this case, he's unjust in his self-defense because he's in the wrong.
Right.
Because the whole motive of him defending himself is, I didn't do nothing wrong. She is my sister, you know. I mean, but yes, it was premeditated. So I don't think he's just in defending himself. Now, if you made a true statement stating why this was done or why this happened, and it was true, I don't believe that's necessarily wrong.
Well, that's kind of a segue. Then how do you feel about when David went to go, he went and picked up the spoils from Goliath, the ephod? How do you feel about that? Was he lying? Or was he?
Sure, he was lying. Sometimes I believe there are scenarios in the Bible where people are forced to make a choice that is the lesser of two evils. For example, I believe there are examples in the Bible where people were put in a position that they either had to lie to save their own life or someone else's life, or be killed, or allow someone else under their care to be killed. So which is worse? To lie to save someone under your care's life, or to allow them to be killed? You know, that's probably how it was viewed from their perspective anyway. I'd rather lie and not let my wife be killed than my wife be killed.
That priest was killed because of that, right?
Yes, the priest was killed because Saul was hacked off.
But we do the same thing. We assume things a lot of times.
Absolutely. I believe if we don't get anything out of this story, there are several things that are clearly seen. Number one, just tell the truth, be honest. It's going to work out for everybody's good if you do. Number two, if you do mess up, God forgives, but own it. And then don't assume. Don't assume. Give people more credit. Love believes the best. I think I read that somewhere. Tweet that one. Put that on the church sign, right?
I had a question Wednesday night that was interesting. We were, one of the kids asked, kind of similar to what you just answered. You know, Christ said, deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. And one of them asked, if I just deny or just say I don't in order to stay alive, and God knows in my heart that I do, where does that leave me? I'd like to have, I know what I told them, but I'd like to have yours.
I've been asked that question a lot. If you will not give your life for Him, you're not one of His.
Amen.
That was clear. I mean, that was clearly understood in the early church. And that's why so many of them gave their life. Because they said, I mean, this was their philosophy. I will lay down my life before I ever deny Christ. Because this world is not my home. That's why you have the juxtaposing theme in the book of Revelation. Those who make their dwelling with God and those who make their dwelling on the earth. And the only reason why someone would not want to give their life here is because maybe they don't believe in eternity as much as they claim.
But they really like this world.
Or they're attached to this world. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. We can claim what we want, but if we love this world and we choose this world over God, we are not His children.
That's why so many Christians are being beheaded, because they're not compromising, and they won't renounce God.
Absolutely.
It would be difficult for a teenager to grasp that
It would.
concept.
It would. That's why it's so important for parents to train their children the proper way, in the Word and the ways of God, and to live it. I think that's the biggest problem that we see in our culture, is so many people aren't living it. You know, they may even bring their kids to church, but what their kids see when they're at home or everywhere else is not the same. And we need a generation here as we approach the coming of the Lord to say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing at any and all cost. And that's just a decision you have to make. And it will prove itself to be presented before you.
That was my answer. So whether they enjoyed the answer or not, Chris,
Yeah, I mean, we didn't write the book. We got to live by it too.
Yeah, our research group actually addresses that. They say that children who are raised in a home where, and it says it very clearly, when the parents are hypocrites, are 85% worse off than children who are raised with nothing.
I agree with that. We were actually talking about that earlier. Go ahead.
With the text in verse 18, it's just to me fascinating because it is appearing that the covenant of the Lord keeping within all this mess. And that's amazing to me in an assuring way of how He will come through in the middle of all this.
Absolutely.
It's very encouraging.
You do see God, as she just said, working throughout all of these poor choices to preserve His covenant. Because ultimately, what's important in all this is that Abraham and Sarah come out alive, that they have the child that they were promised to have, because without him, His promise is null and void. Because ultimately, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 patriarchs, the people of God, all the way down through David, ultimately to Jesus, the reason for any genealogy in our Bible.
When a neighbor in the other city, and you think she was abused or molested?
I believe.
Had they already received that promise? I'm not going back.
No.
Had God not yet spoken to Abraham?
God said He would bless Abraham and his descendants, but they did not know specifically how that would be fulfilled, because that's at the very beginning of.
But he hadn't spoken to Abraham yet and said Sarah will have a child.
No.
Okay.
No, that's in chapter 12, and God never specifically says that out of your bowels and through Sarah will you have the seed of promise until chapter 17, which was
That's why I
which was even after Ishmael. I mean, so you have a pretty large passage of time before they know the particulars of the promise. You know, like I said earlier on when we were going through here, at one point they were convinced Ishmael was the promised child, and they presumed Sarah was unable to have children, and she would simply raise Ishmael as her own, and he would be the one that God would build this family through. Any others?
Can you just elaborate a little bit on covenant? Because as a culture, you know, I mean, just like marriage, how easily vows are broken these days. Apparently, it is pretty important to God, and I don't know that I even fully grasp how important.
I don't believe anyone in our culture understands the depth of covenant, because we're not active in the actual process like they would have been. Like, they actually cut animals in half and walked through the pieces. There was bloodshed. There was visual imagery connected to it. So I don't think we even understand it as well as they would have. But covenant is everything to God. You have the old covenant and the new covenant. Everything in the Word of God centers and works around covenant. And so covenant is God's plan and God's purpose for us as human beings. And it's also what He uses to redeem and restore. Without covenant, there is no restoration to man's fall. There is no fulfillment to any promise of any future or eternity for us as human beings. So covenant is essential. Any others?
But also conditional, right?
They are conditional.
I just think God, he loves us unconditionally, and he's willing to help us get through all these situations.
Any other questions?